I'm hearing the noon whistle in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin right now. And so it's my sign to say that this is Steve Larson of the editorial department up here at Hoard's Dairyman magazine, welcoming you all with us today for our monthly webinar. And glad to have you along with us. We've got a nice group of you folks out there. Just a note, you can download the PowerPoints still if you'd like to do that. Print them out, follow along. And with those comments from those of us up here in Wisconsin, let me turn it over to Mike Hutchins. Mike, you can get us going and introduce our speaker, and away we go.
Very good, Steve. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce a good colleague, friend, and co-worker, Dr. David Reed. David is no stranger. He's been on our program once before, and David owns and operates Rocky Ridge Dairy Consulting over there in Hazel Green, Wisconsin, which is near Dubuque, for those of you that are looking in the map where he might be located. David has spent a number of years, 39 years experience as a practicing veterinarian, worked several years at Bowmatic Madison with their milk quality program here, and of course has done a lot of international traveling and consulting in his time as well. David graduated from Kansas State University, so obviously he's got an interest in the NCAA tournament as far as that goes as well. And anyway, he got several unique awards here from the American Association of Bovine Practitioners, actively involved in the National Mastitis Council as well, with a number of their committees there. So David, I will not take any more time. We're just really pleased to have you on board here and turn the program over to you on the title, Making Use of All That Parlor Data. Dr. David Reed.
Well, thank you, Mike, and I'm really glad to be here today. And hopefully if anybody has questions, they'll get those in, and we'll take some time at the end to answer those questions. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the history of parlor performance data. We're going to review milkability guidelines, and from my last seminar we talked at some length about these. We'll go through them fairly quickly today. We'll discuss a little bit about the commands needed in Dairy Comp, and then we're going to spend a fair amount of time looking at what's really on those reports. You know, where do the numbers come from and what influences those numbers? And then we'll look at a few real dairies toward the end of some parlor summary data that can give some insight as to what goes on dairies. And hopefully, as we go through this, you can think about how could I use some of this data on my own parlor or a parlor that I'm looking at in evaluation mode, okay? So the history started with, actually, Steve Stewart, a veterinarian, was at the University of Minnesota, really interested in looking at both the performance of milking equipment and then how do you evaluate the performance of the overall parlor. So there was a project that Steve drove. It involved the University of Minnesota, Valley Ag Software, and Steve Eicher. Graham Mean, who was in the U.S. at the time, international, well-known international leader in milk quality from Australia, and he was in Wisconsin for 10 years. And Bowmatic was involved in this. They had some funding to increase sales overseas, and they were using it in this particular project. And then Andy Johnson and I were doing some field evaluation. So this went on for a couple of years, really opened many of our eyes to what the possibilities are with working with parlors. So this is directly from Steve's original work. It's kind of a production graph of a typical cow. And then we had spent a lot of time looking at, okay, how can we make some evaluation of the data to know how the people performed and what else happened in that parlor. And so one of the things we looked at was the time and low flow. We look at this and say, well, the front end over here on the left-hand side is definitely influenced by the udder preparation and the overall attitude of the cows when they come into the parlor of the barn. And over on the far end, when we look at low flow, this is more due to the takeoff settings and equipment settings more than anything else. So Stewart preached this from day one, and that was that we can evaluate the people, we can evaluate the equipment, and we can evaluate the cows when we have individual milk weights from a parlor. Many producers originally bought metered systems for their parlors simply to know what the production of the cows were and maybe to get away from DHIA. However, many of us figured out really quickly that we could also look at how the equipment performs and what are the people doing in that parlor. And that's kind of where we're going to go today as we talk about what's going on. So, bottlenecks on dairies, and a lot of people really don't realize what a bottleneck their parlor is. The parlor can be a huge bottleneck, and not only a bottleneck from a performance point of view, but certainly from a production point of view. We know that if we keep cows away from that parlor for too long, we decrease lying time, we can get into some real negative issues from a point of view of milk production. Okay? And then we think about how many milk quality programs and parlors are run. There's no time for thinking. We have to make a management decision. All too often, I see people make decisions in their parlors and on their udder preparation or equipment settings. It's a knee-jerk reaction. It's not looking at the big picture. What really is going to be the impact of this? And frankly, what are we going to measure to know whether the change we just made has been effective or is it not effective, and we need to not do that in the future? So, an interesting observation, when I look at low somatic cell count herds, and typically these are higher producing herds as well, we see more consistent udder preparation, we see more relaxed cows in the barn and parlor, and we see a high degree of consistency between the milk harvest technicians, and that's milking to milking and group to group of people. So here's an example of a parlor summary. This was a Sunday morning parlor summary, and we're going to review this in a little detail in the next slide. Here's the Monday morning. So 2 milkings, 24 hours apart. And when we look at this next slide, we can now look at what production was. So we had 30 pounds on Sunday morning. Monday morning we had 29 pounds. We can jump over and look at the average duration. We were at 4.1. We went to 3.8. We went from 6.8 pounds per minute to 7.4. And if we look at turns per hour, roughly the same, but peak milk is higher on a Monday morning. So the question is, did the milking equipment change? I think the obvious answer is probably no. What did change was the people. So people have a huge impact on the performance of the parlor. And not only when we look at this someday and we would say, well, we still turned this parlor 4.7, 4.8 turns. But what we've done is we've decreased the time that the cows were milked. So 0.3 of a minute, let's assume we could do that same thing for the next 2 milkings. That's almost a minute off of milking time for the same amount of milk. So this means less wear and tear on the teat ends. And at the end of the day, quite honestly, it means happier cows, better behavior in the parlor because of less irritation from the milking process. So an interesting observation number 2 from Reed is that, people really want to make changes to equipment, buy new equipment, change settings, rather than look at training people in a parlor, because it's easier and less stressful. And really, when we think about the best way to improve the overall parlor performance, probably the single most important thing we can do is to train people and then use the parlor data to motivate those people and keep score. How did they do today? How did they do yesterday? And what's expected or what's normal for each of the shifts that they might participate in on that dairy. The goal is what's normal, and then go from there. So when I also think about parlors, a lot of people think, well, my parlor's running as best it can be. So people say, well, this is as good as it's going to get in my parlor. We're going to lock it down, and this is what we're going to do. And then people stop looking for a better way. You can put it another way. Whenever you think you're doing it the best way, it prevents you from looking for a better way. So best is the enemy of better. And what I've found since I've been looking at parlor summaries now since the mid-90s, it's amazing to me the performance that we're seeing on some dairies now. And it's happened slowly and incrementally over time, but it's changed dramatically what goes on in parlors. And I think some of it is responsible probably for some of the increased production that we see. We've learned a lot, and many producers have learned a lot, of fine-tuning their udder preparation, fine-tuning the equipment settings, and then monitoring what happens on a milking-by-milking basis. So one of my daughters sent me this not long ago. Don't cling to a mistake just because you spent a lot of time making it. And I think sometimes we think about this in our parlors is we've always done it this way, we've never done it another way. So we're going to go through the milkability guidelines. But remember, guidelines are just that. They are only guidelines. The most important numbers on a Parlor summary or the data from your Parlor are what are the numbers now and what can happen when management makes changes, either to equipment settings, to personnel being trained and being moved into the Parlor, or to setting changes on detachers or pulsation or other mechanical changes that can be made in the Parlor. So if we look at average milk flow rates, we can see them for 2X, 3X, and 4X. Obviously, the average milk flow is driven somewhat by milk production. Clearly, as we get into lower producing cows and cows that are milked more times per day, those numbers tend to drop a little. Remember, these are baseline numbers, guidelines only. Milking duration, first 25 pounds of milk should be 4 minutes or less. Each additional 10 pounds should add about a half a minute to that milking duration. Okay? 2-minute milk, probably one of the best ways to evaluate the overall udder preparation and cow handling in a Parlor. 3X herd should be in that 14.5 pound range, 2X herds 18.5 pounds. Remember, minimal levels, higher is better. So, percent units are attached. It's driven by the number of technicians, size of the Parlor, the procedures and the routines being followed. And the goal is to obviously have consistency from one group to the next. So we have a question here. Jim, are you going to take care of this so we get this on now?
Yep, go ahead. Turn it on.
Okay.
What's the question? You want to read the question to us?
The question is a high percent time units attached good for the cows? True or false?
Okay, we're voting.
Okay. Yes, and voting pretty rapidly out there. A high percent attached.
Okay, we're off and running here.
My response would be not necessarily. What's best? I don't know, Mike. I'm kind of torn on this one, but I think I'm going to say false.
Well, that's probably a pretty good choice, sir.
Well, and now when I see how people are voting, there seems to be a direction there. We're 2/3 voted. So, Mike, or shall we?
Yeah, let's close her off, and we'll share it with David. And David, what do you think?
Well, it wasn't a trick question, and I'm glad that a very high percentage of the people got this, because if you think about it, if we have a high percentage of the time units are attached, that means milking duration per cow is longer, which means either there's some udder preparation issues, there's some cow handling issues, or there are equipment setting issues, which we probably could fix one or the other or all of those and reduce the percent time units were attached. Typically, well-run parlors that are under 40 stalls with appropriate people in there will probably run in the high 20s to low 30s of units attached times. But again, what is the number on your dairy and what happens to it as you make any changes to your management or settings? So, cows per stall per hour or milk per stall per hour, these are two common ones that we use. We really don't need meters for these, but again, these are guidelines. Typically, we want that 3X parlor to turn 4.5 to 5 times per hour. 2X herds are a little less, 4X herds are a little more, and even larger rotaries at that 6.5 turns or more per hour. And the numbers on the bottom are, again, these are some guidelines, and I can show you herds that are below or above and still run pretty well. Remember, what are the numbers on your dairy now? Peak milk flow rates, 10.5 pounds or higher. 2X, 3X is approximately 9 pounds or higher, and 4X drops down, as you can see in the slide. The other one we look at is the stripping milk testing at the end of milking. As soon as the unit comes off, we go ahead and reach under the cow and begin to aggressively hand milk the cow. Typically go around 2 to 3 times from each teat, and we're looking at the resistance of the cow. Does she react when we pull on her teats? And then how much milk do we actually have in our measuring cup? And we also want to be careful to not strip test cows that are 3-teated or cows that have very unbalanced udders, because These cows typically are not going to milk out evenly, and we don't really want to judge our settings based on this. So what we're after is we want the average cow to have between 100 to 250 milliliters from all 4 quarters, okay? Now, less than a pound of milk or 450 milliliters of milk from all 4 quarters doesn't have an impact on the next milking yield. But in many cases, what we find is that we have 1 or 2 quarters that have, or usually 1 quarter that has a significant amount of milk. That's a unit alignment issue, not an equipment setting issue. And remember, when we talk about this goal of 100 to 250, your very best, fastest milking, highest producing cows will always have very little stripping milk because their production curve is very sharp when it drops down, and so those cows, we cannot set the systems wet enough for them. On the other side, some of your lower producing cows will approach the 450 upper range much more frequently than high producing cows. What we're looking for is where is the average cow in your dairy. So it takes some time and effort in the parlor to determine whether and we're going to set our takeoff settings based on the stripping milk testing. It's very simple. As soon as the unit comes off, hand strip the cow, how much milk is left, and then making a judgment also to the resistance to stripping. So one of the other major things we look at is the unit fall-offs or adjustments required by the technicians in the parlor. We typically want that to be 5 or less per 100 cow milkings. And if it's early, it may indicate in many cases a low vacuum, because if you have good udder preparation and the equipment is set right, you're going to have very high flows. If the vacuum level is too low for any reason, oftentimes we see slippages and maybe even fall-offs early in milking that if we made some adjustments, we could correct those. And typically when we find them late, or we see more fall-offs and squawks or kickoffs at the end of milking, it's unit alignment issues where there's some pain and some teeth so cows react. It could be poor liner condition, or it could just flat be over-milking, which is an equipment setting. So let's go back now and start talking a little bit about the parlor summaries. And the parlor summaries that we typically want to see, we can just go to the command line of DairyComp and type in parlor/W or parlor/P. When you do that and select it, when you enter, excuse me, there will be a, in the middle of the screen will pop up milking 1, 2. If there's 3 milkings or 4 milkings, it will come up as well, along with another line called milking summary. We can also use this command, parlor/M1W, and this will put the wrong pen detail. In other words, it will list every cow that was in the wrong pen, when she was found, where she was found, and where she should be. And you can do that for each of the 3 milkings. So this is what typically comes out at the end of milking. This is for a double 22 parlor. It's very hard to read right here, but we're going to examine it in some detail. So if we now look at just the upper portion of that particular report, parlor summary report, probably one of the first things I look at is milk per cow. And we see that the pens are listed over here, and the total milk produced in that pen in milk per hour, in that pen calculated to milk per hour, and then the actual milk per cow. This is the number of cows milked, and this is a monitor of the cows per hour. And we can look at the total time, and then we can look at start and stop time. But over here, in this column, we're going to look at average flow. And if you think about it, what we said again a minute ago was that if in 3X dairies, we should be at 6.5 pounds per minute. And if it's 31 pounds of milk, we should be milking according to the formula I gave before, in about 4.5 minutes. So normally, when I'm looking at these, I look at this average line across the bottom. If that is different from what it was yesterday at the same milking, I would jump back up and start looking at individual pens. So now we're going to go down to the middle section of the report. And what's really important to remember is when you see this number pen at the top, if you go straight down, that is the average for the entire herd. Okay? From when we see number 4, those are the milking pens and the order in which they were milked. So that's individual data for each pen. This is the data for the whole herd. Okay? So in this case, units were attached 37% of the time. Milk per stall per hour is 140 pounds. Cows per stall per hour, 4.4. And then we go down below and we look at these numbers in the next series between these two broken lines. So the flow rate from 0 to 15 seconds. So what happens is the milking equipment manufacturer sends a message to Dairycom on a time basis. And so the milk produced in the first 15 seconds is multiplied by 4 and entered in this column. In other words, if the cow continued to milk at that level for a full minute, her average flow in this case would be 1.8 pounds per minute. Okay? So that's a calculated number. This 1.8 is calculated. Flow rate from 15 to 30, again, the milking equipment sends a message to Dairycom, how much milk was produced in that 15-second period. Dairycom multiplies it by 4, puts it into this column, again, a calculated number, 6.2. When we look at the 30 to 60-second flow range, or time range, the flow there is now multiplied by 2 to get the calculated flow rate. And then in most systems, what we see is that the peak milk flow is really the milk between the first and the second minute. However, there's an exception to that. The GIA systems typically will use and I'm not exactly sure of their definition, but it's a period of time between the first and the second minute when they designate as peak milk flow. But most other systems, it's the total milk between the first and the second minute. So if we look at these numbers right here, one of the things I've seen people look at the 0 to 15-second range and want to put a number on that. I've had some people say, oh, it must be over 2 pounds per minute. Remember, if you put teacups on individually, one at a time, how much time in that 15 seconds is there actually the normal vacuum level in the claw? In other words, it's very low, so you're going to have a very low flow rate. Now, we also have some technicians that can quickly grab the unit and place 2 teacups at a time on, so the time where the actual vacuum level is stable is quite a bit longer. I do not I do not look at this and say that 0 to 15 is an extremely important number. I like to know what it is for your dairy, but it's going to vary based on the skill of the technicians and how quickly they attach the units. Okay. So if we look at the 15 to 30, this time frame, we actually have relatively stable vacuum unless we have liner squats. In this case, it's 6.2 pounds, but then look what happens. It drops back to 5.1, and then for peak flow, it jumps up to 7.5. So really what the issue is here is that we see a little bit of a bimodal pattern in the whole herd, which typically says our udder preparation timing is not what it should be. In other words, 10 to 12 seconds of teat contact time to stimulate oxytocin, and then attach the units 90 seconds later. Okay, so then we go down into the lower section, and we're looking at milk in the first 2 minutes. So this is 12 pounds. We said that we'd like to see a 3x dairy be at least 14.5 pounds. And then I really typically don't look much at the milk in the percent of milk in the first 2 minutes. I really look at the total pounds. Some people look at the percentage. I look at pounds. And we also can look at the time and low flow, and this will depend on the manufacturer. Sometimes this is not presented, depending on the level of software that was purchased from the manufacturer, or depending on what did I do here? So we'll move here, and then we can look to the bottom section, and now we get a little bit of an error summary. This varies a little bit by manufacturer. There are some definitions over on the left-hand side here that you can go through. One of the ones we look at a lot is the manual detach, because manual detaches, they are controlled by the technicians. When we see some manual detaches, that doesn't mean there's anything really wrong, because if we have a double 20 Parlor and there's 1 unit on a cow and it's dribbling, we probably should take it off, post-dip, and turn the side. So we can look at what's normal for each shift when it comes to these manual modes and these other error summaries. And then if we look to the bottom, we can then see the stall numbers. They're not all listed, but if you look across the bottom on that part of the report, there'll be what the average is. So and what we're looking at then is the computer or Dairycom will then look at the performance of each stall and say, are there obvious differences? And we'll see some of those as we move a little farther around into the presentation. And then one of the things we do see is a difference from side to side. So if you look at more recent, the recent Parlor summaries, you'll see side 1 and side 2 in side-by-side parlors. So whether it's a herringbone or a parallel, you'll see this. And so the data is being kept from one side, comparing one side to the other. So we do see some issues. So if we look right here now in another parlor summary, we see 2 stalls, stall 30 and stall 44. They have minus 22 and minus 23 pounds of milk. Basically, the meter's broken and not working properly. But go down to the bottom and we look at side 1 and side 2. There's a 4-pound difference right here. There's the average. There's the 4-pound difference, and there's a difference, a significant difference here, and also some difference around power and motor number. If we look at the next 2 shifts for the same dairy, we see the same kind of effect. And this oftentimes occurs in older parlors with large cows where there's a post installed in every divider in a parallel parlor. In other words, the cows are having difficulty turning around that post, particularly on the left-hand side of the parlor. So good indication sometimes that maybe that parlor should be upgraded and new front ends installed to make it easier for the cows and to get our production back to what it should be. Remember that when a cow is standing in a stall, it takes the willing cooperation of the cow to achieve full milk out. So we can also look at those errors. There's a significant number of errors that can occur. There's ID errors, cows not identified. We can see things such as cows ID'd but not having a unit attached. We'll go through some of these. Probably the most common one that many dairymen find useful is cows in the wrong pen. We'll look at some of these in a little different light in a few minutes. And these are some of the examples. We've got an animal was not read. We didn't find her, or the computer didn't see her at all. We can see there's a cow here that has a significant number of rates being missed. We can see no attached message. So we had an ID message, but no attached, 0 milk. Those are the kind of things we can look at and kind of determine what's going on in our parlor. So there's an issue here. And if you look closely, there's no milk from the stall, but every one of these cows has an ID attach time. But there's no duration. So it brings us to our next question. What are the possible causes when the error report creates an ID for each stall with no attach times and no milk weights?
Okie doke. Well, here we go. We're off and running. Steve?
See, all the milk.
So we have choices. All the meters are broken on this side. That seems kind of unusual. The meters didn't send the data. Sounds like a Republican problem. The side was exited before any units are attached. And none of the above. Interesting. Steve, are you going to vote on this one?
Well, I'm going to go with none of the above because I'm a little puzzled by this all, but I see, the voting's a little slow on this one today, Mike.
Yeah.
It is kind of slow here.
It's a bit of a stumper out there.
I think I'm going to go with the meters did not send the data. It's hard to believe that they're all broken on one side, but that's okay. It could be a Democratic parlor, it's all broken. We can move on. Anyway, we're holding on here. We're not going to give you much more time. Come on, folks, got to vote here. We're at 2/3. Jim, let's close the polls and let's show David. What do you think?
Okay, because this was when I first saw this. This was a good number of years ago. It's actually the third choice. The side was exited before any units were attached. In other words, many of these parlors have an index. So the cows are loaded, a button is punched to push the cows back slightly to index them into proper position. And in this case, a technician punched the exit button rather than the index. Basically lifted the front gates and all the cows left. So we can see some things that happen in a parlor. For instance, if this happened in the middle of the night and I was looking at the parlor reports the next morning on my dairy, I could know that these cows were at milk last night. We can learn a lot about what goes on in the parlor by looking at the data. Okay. So when we think about monitoring, one of the things we look at is what's controlled by the technicians in the parlor. So there's a good list here. Average flow, average duration, turns per hour, or effective speed on a rotary. We'll get to that in a minute. And we can also look at milk in the first 2 minutes, time and low flow, and manual detaches. These are things that typically I would look at and discuss with management on a dairy as far as making recommendations, and we decide which we were going to monitor for their parlors. Here's an example We have filter stocks from each of the 3 shifts, a parlor summary from each of 3 shifts. We have some data from the milk plant, and we also have a bulk tank culture. So they post these on the dairy, and people know exactly what's going on. Here's another example where a producer has just highlighted some of those important pieces of data on this report that he's wanting to monitor for his technicians, and that's another way of doing it. So one of the things we look at on rotaries is that how many cows can we milk, and what's an effective measure of what goes on. So this is a 72 stall rotary, and it has very consistent cow handling and very good loading in the parlor. So one of the numbers that we look at is that in dairy comp will take the, I pointed to work here, so it takes the total time, 6 hours and 37 minutes, converts that to seconds, then divides it by the number of milk weights, okay? And that gives us the effective speed on the rotary. That's on the second page of a rotary report. So in this case, it was 6.66 seconds, okay? Second shift, we see that we're at 561 cows an hour. Effective speed is 6.3. Third shift, 5.97. I'll tell you that this deck was running at it was just over 5 1/4 seconds per stall. That was the speed of the rotary. It was the same all the time. It did not change the speed of the rotary. This is a 72 stall rotor, set with relatively dry detacher settings, and yet we can turn this thing, in this case on third shift, we're turning it at 8.1 turns per hour. And this is important. We want to look at what the turns per hour are on those rotaries, and we want to know cows per hour. So if we were to type in the command Parlor, which you see here, it'll bring up this menu, and we can select one of those. It will bring us up to milk deviation for each stall. And if we hit the escape key at that point, it brings up this menu in the middle of the screen. If we selected duration, it would give us, in the top part of this screen right here, we see a lot of data, but these are the individual milking durations for each stall. So we go to the bottom, in this particular barn, we see across here the minimal milking time for the stalls on one side of the parlor, the average in the middle, and the longest time at the bottom. Same thing on the other side of the parlor. So I look across here and I see a 2 and a 2, 2, couple of 1/8. If this dairy has a 2-minute front end delay, in other words, from the time the technician punches a button till the time the meter actually takes over, is set at 2 minutes. So there's a 2-minute wait period before the meter flow rate data actually takes over. This is a report I look at to say, is the front end delay set appropriately on the dairy? We would probably drop that to 90 seconds and then come back in and look and see if we have cows at 1.5 minutes. We can also go to graph, and one of the things that's really kind of cool is that if you go, when you're in, now we have duration up, so we have a screen with all of the durations. We go to graph, we can get a picture. We can also go, we can move it over to report or to grid. Report, if you click on the report on your dairy and go all the way to the bottom, you will see the definitions for the various components across the top, and we'll get to that in a minute. So if we selected the graph, then we're going to see over here is a code for pens and colors. We can see if there's cows in the wrong pen almost immediately. The other thing we can do, and it's not live here, but I could go to the corner and make a square and drag it down like this, and it would expand the data out. Now I just clicked and went to the next slide, but when we did that, now we can look, and obviously in this one you see different colors, so they're in the wrong pens. We can also look at, these are reattaches. Every time you see a white dot on one of these, it's a reattach. And what you can do, when it's live, you can click on each individual cow and it will tell you the ID. And when we expand this, if we were to make our expansion down and click, we could then look at where that reattach occurred. And then we can also look at, this is a big deal for product performance. Now there's one cow on one side of a parlor and there's 3 over here. So if that's the case, we're slowing down the parlor dramatically. So we can look at this data very quickly and determine what's going on in the dairy. We can expand it out, which I've done now, and now we can see here's an early reattach. Probably unit fell off or kicked off and put back on. Here's a long milking cow. We also see some shorts, and then we see a late reattach over here. And many of these late reattaches are probably when someone comes by to post it to cow. We really shouldn't be attaching at that point. So what do you see? This is a 50-stall rotary. And there's something pretty that you can see on this picture that would, if you think about a rotary, it should be going continuously. What happened right here? We didn't attach a unit for a period of time. Okay. If you go to this side, look here. Look at the big gap right here. So this means that the deck has stopped. Rule number one on a rotary, never stop the deck to load cows. If you miss a cow, you miss a cow, but don't stop the deck. Keep it rolling. So I can look. Now, if you think about it, what kind of a pen do you think this is? If you look over here, look at the number of reattaches that occurred in here. I'm telling you, this was a fresh pen on a dairy. This was a high percentage of first calf heifers, and the timid ones and the newest cows are the last ones in, and they were doing a very poor job of moving cows into the parlor. Very aggressive, upset the cows dramatically, and a tremendous number of fall-offs and kickoffs. So here's a case where I can see in the data, and now when I go out and look at the parlor, it matches up because they were not handling cows properly. We can look at others and see the routine. So in this case, we're in a 6-cow routine. When you spread it out, you can see the 6-cow routine. You can see, remember, there's 2 people in here. It may not be an issue here, but it might be. But we can also look at other pieces of information at the same time. This is 72-stall rotary. What do you see here? This is really cool. How many times did this cow go around the deck? 3 times. Here's a cow that went twice. And the other thing you see these little blips right here? It means that there's 2 people attaching. Somebody's going back and helping somebody attach. They're getting behind. So this is a dairy that's probably running the deck too fast, or they don't have the people trained properly to actually perform on the deck. This is a double 44, and we're in a situation here where they're drying 2 cows and then attaching, dry and attach, or they're prepping cows, but then drying and 2 and then attaching 2. But yet, all of a sudden, you see right here. Notice what's happening right here? There's no 2-stall sequence right here. It's one right after the other. We can find these subtle changes that happen during milking. And so some people put cameras in. If we had meters, we could go to this parlor and look at this data and know exactly what the technicians were doing. Because we can also, this is the menu that comes up in the middle. So if we look at the menu in the middle, we were in duration before. We can also go to order. We can go to time of attachment. So in this case, we can look across here. We can see the order of attachment. The other one that's really, this is a really important number, is the gap number. And gap is, you don't see it on the first 2 sides because it's the last unit detached to the first unit attached on the next side. And so one of the things we look at in there, particular in here, we're 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 5, 4, 5. So if you wanted to speed a parlor up, if you can drop 30 seconds to a minute and a half off the gap time. I mean, if sometimes they can do it in 2 to 3 minutes, how come it takes 5 on most of them? So we ask ourselves, what can we do to make that better? And that's a way to speed up the parlor. And so when we look at, if we go, I mentioned it before, but if we go to the bottom, we could see a grid, report, or graph. And if you go to the report and then page all the way down, it will give you the definitions across the top here. In other words, gap, last detach to first attach. Fill time is seconds per cow to fill a side. And granted, some of these are crazy. I'm not sure, 56 seconds per cow. That might be that this was the first turn and they let the cows come in on their own and no one ever moved them, that sort of thing. So, but we can look at this kind of data. And then we can also, analyze this on a shift-by-shift basis and say, okay, if one group of technicians can accomplish these times in a certain level, how come the other groups can't? And we can also look, we talked about this already, that we can look where, in this case, we're in a 2-cow. If you look at the data up at the top, we wipe 2, attach 2, wipe 2, attach 2. And we can look across the bottom and we can see what's going on. We can also see the gap times in here. And remember, if there's more than one technician, it's 0 when the first meter button is punched, and it's consecutive after that, and it just timestamps it, and these are in seconds, okay? So PG305, if we were to select the summary, in other words, if we went to Parlor or the Parlor /W or any of those other commands from Parlor /, we would get milk 1, 2, or 3, or 4, and milking summary. So if we click on summary, it's going to bring up this menu on the left-hand side over here. We can click all milkings, all pens, and then we can select the individual items. So in this case, I selected on a dairy not too long ago, I selected average flow, which is in red, and average duration, which is in blue. And these were Bromatic shutoff, Bromatic Parlor, where they just rebuilt the shutoffs with new rubber diaphragms and plunges. Look at the difference, what happened in average flow rate, look what happened to milking duration. So I can look at things on this data and say, what happened on your dairy? And I can go down to the bottom, there's a calendar which I've cut off, and I can look at what's actually going on. Okay, here's another example where we've made changes, in about a 30-day window, and we've increased a pound per minute, and we've also decreased milking time by a minute. We can clearly document what happens when we can look at this data. Another example of takeoff changes, different liners, different vacuum levels. It's one of the things that I tell people is cows don't lie. So we can look at this data. Here's different inflations. We went from a stiffer liner to a thicker liner to a high performance liner. Notice that average flow has jumped up, milking duration has continued to decline. These are the kinds of things we can document on a dairy. So when we find, one of the things that happens is when we fine-tune the Parlor settings and we fine-tune the udder preparation, the numbers from each shift come together. So there's 1 shift, 2 shifts, 3 shifts. And if we look across on those particular, for this dairy, there's milk per cow, very consistent. Average flow, consistent. Average duration, consistent. Milk per stall, a little better on the night milking, but turns per hour are up on that one as well. And we look at peak flow. Even though the turns per hour were up, their peak flow is still quite good. So I can look across this information. Many dairies will tell you that milk production will vary depending on the milking of the day, and the morning milking is always higher. I would say when we fine-tune the cow handling and the udder preparation and the equipment settings, they come together. So this is another example. This is a very large rotary, milking a lot of cows, 672 cows an hour. But look what happens here, 1.7, 5.9, 5.5, 13 pounds in the first 2 minutes, but look, seconds and low flow, 53. It tells us right away, and then you go down here and look, and there's manual detaches. Of 7,400 cows, 1,309 manual detaches. I can tell you right now that if we changed the settings and did some things to this parlor, we could make this parlor run a lot better. We also know that here's the effective speed of the rotary. It's 5.2 seconds. So this deck is running at about a little over 4.5 seconds per stall. Extremely hard to keep up on the udder preparation. Here's an example of a really high performance dairy. And this is right across the top is average flow. This is milking duration. Went to the dairy, made a change in the ratio of the pulsation. The next day they rebuilt the pulsator. So when we changed the ratio, we saw a bump in milk and a little bit of drop in on time. The on time stays the same, and when the pulsators were rebuilt, flow rate goes up. I said to the dairyman, what happened? And he goes, oh, we went up in milk. And this is the dairy. Again, first milking, second milking, third milking, and I'll put a summary in. This is probably some of the best parlor performance I've ever seen. So we're looking at, in this case, there's a little more milk in the noon milking, or the afternoon milking, but look at the flow rates. These are on a 3X dairy. Average durations here, and look at peak milks, 20 pounds in the first 2 minutes except for third shift. And remember, dairy comp rounds things off, so we can get into some issues with this, but exceptional numbers. And if anybody would have told me we could get 34 pounds of milk in 3.6 minutes a few years ago, I probably would have said you're crazy. But also, look, very few manual detaches, but there are some, because these people have been coached that we don't want to slow the parlor down with 1 or 2 cows. We'll manually take them off. So we think about where we're at. It's exactly what Steve Stewart said in the middle 90s. We can monitor individual cow performance, the people performance, and equipment function by having milk meters and then having it hooked up to dairy comp, so we can look at all of this data, put in any which way we want, and we can print off reports that we can use to motivate our people to do the right things. Just a little bit of a summary slide, and hopefully those of you that signed in here will print this stuff and can use these. But remember, these are guidelines only. The most important numbers are the numbers on your dairy. So with that, Mike, we're going to close out and look for some questions.
Well, very good. Steve, I guess we'll turn it back to you at this point.
Very good. Wonderful job, Dave Reed. As always, you're a real professional, and you covered a lot of ground, gave us a lot of things to think about, so we really appreciate the fine job you've done. And while you're catching your breath there a little bit and while Mike is organizing the questions, we will just remind folks that in a couple of days you'll be receiving a survey regarding this webinar. We appreciate your response on that. As always, this webinar and all of our previous ones are available on our archives. Go to horge.com and the webinar section of the web page, and you can have access to those. And now it's time to look ahead. As you can see on the screen, Nigel Cook from the University of Wisconsin-Madison is going to be talking about ventilation. He's on our April 10th webinar. He's made quite a number of observations of some various size barns around upper Midwest, and that should be very interesting. And then Mike, our co-host here and partner, covering on-farm feeding diagnostics, coming up on May 8th, webinar sponsored by Ajinomoto Heartland Incorporated. So we're looking forward to that too, Mike. And with those comments, what kinds of questions might we have out there?
Well, I have a couple that we started out with, and let's go to these first, and we'll go from there. This is from United Arab Emirates. What about the new electronic information generated inside of the Parlor? Milk progesterone, temperature, rumination, cow movement. Well, the question is how reliable. I think we're going to see more and more of this kind of monitoring of Parlors, and hopefully we can get this kind of information loaded into a management program such as Dairycomp or the individual manufacturer. But there has to be a way to evaluate this data fairly quickly so that you can not look at too many cows to find the oddball cow that you really need to look at. Will we see more of this? Absolutely. I think dairymen that are now using some of the rumination data will tell you it's probably the best thing they've ever seen on their dairy. They can pick up cows before they show any clinical signs sometimes, in particular for mastitis and some other issues. So we will see more of this. There'll be more and more information generated on dairies. So another question, this was from Iran, believe it or not, and how many milking units do you need for 500 lactating cows? And is there a formula? And there is formula. There are formulas, and they're fairly simple when you look at them. So one of the things we look at is obviously the number of cows, and we know that from this question right here. Then we need to know how long they want to milk for. So how long is the milking shift? So is it once a day, twice a day? Or I'm sorry, is it twice a day, 3 times a day, or any combination there? So if we look at that steady state throughput, we could divide that number of cows by the shift length, okay, and that gives you cows per hour. And then cows per hour, you can divide that by turns per hour. And if you go back, way back in this presentation, I had some data in there that said if we were in 3X dairies, we should be in that 4 to 4.5 turns per hour with a full udder prep. So we could take the turns per hour and divide the cows per hour, and that would tell us the actual number of stalls that we need in the parlor. So it depends really, because it depends on the number of operators and the type of udder preparation that's going to be performed, and a lot of decisions made by the dairy. But they can be calculated out. We had another question from Romania. Which is the best milking system, rotary or classic parlors, rotaries, or robotic milking? And again, the answer, it depends. One of the things that I see in the industry is if we're above about 2,100 to 2,200 cows, if we install a rotary, we can milk from there up to about almost 4,000 cows an hour, or per milking, on a 72 stall rotary. And we can do it with less labor than a side-by-side parlor. Less than 2,200 cows, probably a side-by-side is better from a labor point of view. We see more and more robotics. I think it has a lot to do with the labor situation. Robotic milkers are getting better. They do have some issues in some cases trying to achieve some of the product performance or the per cow performance that we've shown today in this presentation. It's going to be very difficult. But the companies are working hard to improve their efficiencies, which makes it easier for them because they can get more cows per robot. So those are hopefully answers some of those questions, and if we have any more, we'll go try to make use of those as well. try to answer those.
Sure, we certainly do, David. We have several questions. First one, I think, is a great one. How often do you suggest having milker personnel meetings and going over the data points?
Okay, so one of the things that I do, what I recommend would be that we post several key performance indicators. So we went through some of those, whether it's turns per hour, but I always want to see milk per cow, turns per hour, maybe average flow and milk in the first 2 minutes. So we would post those after every milking. And I'd say at least once a week we should meet with each milking crew to review the numbers, what happened during the last week, and what are the process and protocols and procedures we want them to follow. It's simply good coaching to continue to work on a very regular basis. So the more frequently, like at least once a week for that, I think is important. It's a brief meeting, but it reviews the procedures and routines and says, here's your scorecard for last week, your report card.
And David, that leads into our next question, and that is politically, do you compare crews head to head, or do you not do that? In other words, how do you handle the data? Let's say one crew is much better or not as good as, say, the other crews that may be on the Parlor?
Well, I think what we do is we look at it and say, okay, if we have one crew that can achieve certain numbers, what's the issue with the other crews that they can't? So now it's management's job to say, okay, what factors are influencing the performance of this parlor? Is it the people, or is it maybe the cow movers bringing cows in such a way that they're not relaxed when they come to the parlor? So maybe the crew's doing things pretty right, but it's the cow's attitude coming into the parlor. It just says, it raises the flag that we should be able to see relatively consistent numbers from each of the 2 or 3 or 4 milkings if we have consistent udder preparation and consistent cow handling. So now it's a question of working through that and saying, okay, what's going on and what are people doing? And typically, I'd see more issues with people bringing cows to the parlor. Lots of times not well trained, and they've never been really coached on how to properly move cows to the parlor.
Okay, this is kind of a question maybe just on the PowerPoints. And the question, stay with me on David, it says 25 pounds with an S behind it. And he wants to know, or they want to know, is that 25 pounds per second, or is the S mean 25 mean plural for pounds?
It's plural for pounds, and I think, unless if I'm thinking of the right slide, unless it was a deviation, if it might be 25 pounds S. I'd have to go back and look at the presentation.
Okay. We may get a feedback on that as well, but I think you're right. I think it's just a plural of the pounds. Another question came in, and that has to do with rewarding the technicians. Do you see that common on farms here in the U.S. in terms of rewarding based on somatic cell count or achieving goals for the parlor and stuff like that?
Well, I'd see some people try the somatic cell count one. I think that one, so many other factors involved, it's hard. I think some people will look at performance goals in the parlor, so turns per hour, that sort of thing, and do some rewarding on that. I have some people that actually have a 2-stage wage. Base wage is you just show up and you're there and you're on time and that. The performance wage is it's usually a couple bucks an hour. And what they do is they say, it's real simple. To get the performance wage, you perform the procedures and routine that we teach you. If someone in management sees you not milking correctly, you're going to lose like 50 cents of that performance bonus for the pay period. And on some days, they actually take it away from the whole crew. In other words, if I'm not milking correctly and Mike and I are milking together, I lose the 50 cents or the 25 cents an hour, and Mike does too. In other words, we want people to be looking out for each other, saying, hey, we need to do this right because this is costing me money if it doesn't. So that's one way to do it, but I think it's difficult sometimes on somatic cell or mastitis levels, probably better on performance, or in this case, just following the right routine.
Okay, very good. Another question just came in. When would you know is the time that you need to adjust the pulsator pressure?
Well, pulsator, what we do is that number one is we graph it so we know what it is, and we look at those numbers and we say, okay, what can we do to help make cows milk out quicker? And we would look at that, in particular say that the D phase or the closed phase of the liner can be in the low 200 millisecond range from a pulsation point of view, and we would set the B phase, which is the open phase of the liner, typically up in the 490 to 500 range, 480 to 500 range. And we do that by adjusting rates and ratios. Now, that's not possible on all equipment. Some have limitations on what their settings can be, although we're seeing more and more companies come around and give a wide range of settings that we can then achieve that low 200 millisecond for the D phase and the upper 480 to 500 for the B phase. So we graph first, then we make an adjustment and regraph to make sure it's correct, and follow the maintenance recommendations for that particular pulsator as determined by the manufacturer.
Okay. We have one more question here, and that has to do with reattachments. And the question come in, it looks like you were differentially deciding when you should reattach depending on the length, the phase of the milking time. What's your philosophy on reattachments of units?
Okay, so reattachments would be if you see a unit that's been either kicked or fallen off and there's obviously visible milk and it's early in that particular cycle for that cow, then a reattach. I discourage unit attachments at post-dipping, because what happens is if the unit's been off the cow for a minute or a minute and a half or 2 minutes, the teats will have a significant milk in them, and many people will put units back on. So I discourage reattaching at post-dipping. And if it's a rotary, typically we look at it and say if it's off at a certain point on the deck, it gets reattached. Otherwise, it doesn't. Reattachments can be a bit of an issue. Many technicians believe that management will get after them if they don't get the last drop of milk from every cow. We can probably do more harm with reattaches than goods in most cases, so be careful with them. And then manual detaches, that goes hand in hand. We probably don't. I would be wondering what's happening on a dairy if they had no manual detaches. I would expect to see a few in every dairy. Excessive, like the one I showed with 1,300 out of 7,000 cows, we need to fix that.
Fantastic. The follow-up question for me would be that the reattachment just takes time away from other critical things in the milking sequence. Could one say, well, I'll get her next time? In other words, we're milking 3X or 4X. She just gets to keep that milk for the next milking. Any thoughts or comments?
Right, and remember that you have to repeatedly leave significant milk to hurt the actual milk flow from the cow. One milking is not going to do it. So you're correct, Mike. And the other thing is, if we think about Parlor performance, I mean, if we put that unit back on and it's a double 20 and we've got 1 unit milking and we're holding up a 20 because of that, it really does impact our overall Parlor performance. And we got cows standing on concrete, standing away from feed, standing away from watering beds. That's not good.
Another question that just came in has to do with, automation in the parlor. This person says, I've got trying to keep 50 meters or 100 meters running. I'm just not going to put any meters in at all. And we'll just operate the parlor without any of that automation. What's your take on that?
Well, my take is that there are, if you search around right now, there are companies that have flow-through type meters that have very minimal maintenance. And basically, there's an O-ring diaphragm that gets replaced once a year. And you can then get performance data from your Parlor. And basically, you have that and a shutoff valve. And many, even Parlors with no automation, have shutoff valves. So they still need some maintenance even when they have no automation. In other words, no automatic detaches, but a device that can actually shut the vacuum off to remove the unit. So I guess I would say, if I'm a dairyman and I really want to manage my business, I believe that the best way to do that in a large parlor, when you're not going to be in there very often, is to have this parlor data and then get good at looking at the data to know how to motivate and challenge your people to do the right thing in the parlor. I mean, I would say it is absolutely one of the best investments you can make on your dairy.
That word challenge came up with another question. That is, do you believe, I guess his question is, or her question is, do you every milking, you print all this information and post it after every swing, every milking, every day? Or that seems like...
milking every day. It prints out automatically on DairyCom, unless you disable it. And so I have some parlors where, I have one parlor in particular we had a lot of issues with. It was a fairly large parlor, over 40 stalls. We had 3 people milking. They were territorial, but each one did a group. So they did 2 groups in each territory. And we actually printed a Parlor summary. You can tell Dairycom to print a Parlor summary for a certain number of stalls on each side of the Parlor. We printed 3 Parlor summaries, one specific for each individual, and then we printed an extra Parlor for the whole summary for the whole Parlor. When we did that, we saw the numbers from a point of view of milk per cow and flow rates, and all of the numbers got very, very close together. And so, to me, it's a little bit like if you begin to evaluate numbers on a regular basis, if you stop doing it, it becomes not important for the people you're measuring. So it needs to be done every milking, basically.
Is there any advantage of doing some pooling? In other words, a 2-day average or a 3-day average?
Yep, we do that a lot when we have days where we look at individual crews. The other thing is some days we'll milk 3 times a day, but actually have 2 crews. So they work a longer shift. So then your morning milking or the first milking of the day, last milking of the day, there's probably no overlap of people. The middle milking, you have people from 2 different shifts milking. So we need to figure out a way to monitor the actual people, and we can do that averaging over periods of days, and many times dairies will average over a week for each shift, and that's the data. They post it every day. They average it like that and show that to the technicians on their weekly meeting. And that's a real short weekly meeting. I mean, it's 10 minutes and they're done.
Well, David, you've answered all the questions in a yeoman's fashion. So, Steve, we'll turn it back to you to wrap it up.
Well, yes, you certainly have done well, Dave. We do have about 1 minute left here. I was just wondering, there are some good-sized Jersey herds out there, and I've just wondered if you would comment on your benchmark figures as they might relate to, say, Jersey operations.
So
I assume that most
the
of the
number
data...
for Jersey is obviously, remember, if you go back and look at when I was showing those numbers on, there's basically Holstein numbers, performances over 2, 3, and 4x milking. Jerseys are going to be lower, but again, if we remember, my key point was that what's on the dairy right now, what's normal for the dairy right now, and that's where we want to be. I mean, I can certainly give you some numbers from Jerseys, but I don't have as many of those, and so it's a little harder to really say what, quote, normal should be. I would say what's on your dairy, and then go from there.
Right. Okay, excellent. Well, you did a great job all the way through, Dave. Good presentation, wonderful job with the questions. We thank everyone who has been with us. We still have a good crew of you out there paying attention, and we appreciate that very much. So we again thank David Reed, and we thank our partners down at the University of Illinois, Mike Hutchins and Jim Baltz. And just looking ahead, April 10, Nigel Cook, ventilating barns. May 8th, feeding diagnostics, Mike Hutchins, and Giannamoto Hartland going to be sponsoring that one. We look forward to having you all with us on our future webinars. Thanks for participating.